Can you imagine Max Verstappen, four-time world champion, struggling in qualifying as if he were driving on ice? His performance in Monaco left everyone speechless, and not for good reasons. Before we continue, tell me in the comments, do you think Red Bull is losing its way on street circuits? What's going wrong with the most dominant team of recent years? In this video, I explain why Verstappen failed to shine in Monaco and what could change the course of the championship. To understand what really happened with Max Verstappen in the classification of the Monaco 2025 Grand Prix, the context in which this season is being developed, first, you have to develop this season. Verstappen is not just another pilot on the grill, it is the four-time world champion of Formula One, the absolute reference of Red Bull racing, and the dominant figure of the championship in recent years. But in Monaco, something changed. It was not a punctual error or an isolated bad day. What we saw was the raw exhibition of a series of weaknesses that the team had managed to hide or manage in other more favorable circuits, but that in the narrow and techniques of the Principality were naked. The fact that Verstappen and 7/10 of the pole time, marked by Lando Norris, is not only unusual, it is worrisome. We are talking about a huge margin in a sport where differences are usually measured in thousandths of a second. And even more serious is that this difference is not due to a perfect turn from Norris or a specific error of Verstappen. It is a combination of technical, strategic and operational factors that directly affected the performance of RB21, a car designed with a very specific philosophy that seems to be showing its limits in certain scenarios. This result, far from being a simple anecdote, could mark a turning point in the season. In previous years, even when the car was not 100%, Max was able to extract tenths where other pilots could barely stay on track. But this time it was different. The subsequent statements of Verstappen himself revealed something unusual in him: real frustration, feeling of helplessness, and above all, a lack of total trust in his vehicle. He literally said that driving the RB21 in slow curves was like ice manage. And if the most dominant pilot of recent years is saying that, something very deep is failing within the team. This context forces us to analyze in more detail what is really happening with Red Bull. Because it's not just a bad weekend. What is at stake here is the structure of a project that has reigned for several seasons, and that could now be facing its first great real threat. Monaco's performance not only generates doubts about the car, but puts on the table a question that increasingly sounds with more force in the paddock. Is Red Bull losing control of the championship just when you need to keep it the most? When talking about the low performance of Max Verstappen in the Monaco 2025 classification, it is impossible to ignore the core of the problem: the technical limitations of the Red Bull RB21. What at first glance may seem like a pace of rhythm or a pilot error, it is actually the consequence of a series of engineering decisions that, although they have worked in most of the calendar paths, turned out to be ineffective and even counterproductive in the urban circuit of the Principality. The most worrying thing is that these problems are not new or strangers for the team. From the RB19 in 2023, it was known that Red Bull's cars had structural difficulties in low speed circles with closed curves and aggressive curbs. Monaco, with more than 60% of the layout composed of curves below 100 km per hour, was the toughest test so far. One of the key points that came to light was the lack of mechanical grip of the RB21, something that resulted in a constant sensation of severing at the curve entrance and loss of traction at the exit. Verstappen was explicit about it. There was no balance, there was no response, and every attempt to attack a curb or forcing the trajectory ended in a fight against the rear train. This erratic behavior not only affects the pilot's confidence, but it compromises the entire return, since it forces to conduct conservatively, something that no elite pilot wants to do in classification. In the words of Verstappen, the car simply did not respond, and that, in a place like Monaco, where the margin of error is practically non-existent, means the end of any aspiration to pole. The origin of these problems is found in the RB21 design philosophy itself. Red Bull has built a car designed to dominate in medium and high-speed circuits, where aerodynamic efficiency and load generated by the flat background make a difference. But that advantage is diluted when you enter the field of urban paths. McLaren and Ferrari, on the other hand, have opted for more versatile approaches. Their monoplays prioritize suspension efficiency, chassis adaptability, and power transmission in closed curves. And that was evidenced in Monaco. While the RB21 struggled to stay stable in the braking areas in closed turn, the MCL38 and the SF25 flowed with a disturbing naturalness, taking advantage of every millimeter of asphalt without suffering the fluctuations that affected the Red Bull. Another determining factor was the extremely narrow operational window of RB21. In Monaco, any small change in the configuration had disproportionate effects. Trying to reduce, subwiring generated immediate survival. Modify the height of the body to gain stability, compromise the absorption of the curbs. The car did not accept adjustments without generating a new problem. And all this was aggravated by the specific conditions of the Monégasque asphalt, full of potholes, surface changes, and adhesion variations. Telemetry showed losses of up to 0.3 of a second in Sector 2, especially in critical areas such as the Rascasse, the pool, and the exit of a tunnel. Areas where precision is vital and the margin for errors null. Even the Honda engine, which normally offers a progressive and controlled power delivery, showed difficulties in synchronizing acceleration with the extreme direction angles that Monaco demands. Instead of being an ally, it became one more element to manage, adding stress to the already committed handling of the car. All this configures a scenario in which Verstappen did not have the necessary tools to compete at the expected level of it. And that, for a pilot accustomed to exploiting each tenth with surgical precision, is a source of constant frustration. We are no longer talking about a bad classification. What we saw was a clear warning that RB21, however dominant it has been in other contexts, has vulnerabilities that can be exploited by their rivals. McLaren and Ferrari have not only reached Red Bull in some lands. In this type of circuits, they have openly surpassed them. And the most worrying thing is that this is not the only urban circuit of the calendar. What happens in Monaco does not stay in Monaco. It is one thing to have a car that does not respond as expected, and another, very different, is to make decisions that end up worsening the situation from the wall. And that was exactly what happened with Red Bull during the classification in Monaco. What in principle was a technical disadvantage, unique but manageable, ended up becoming a structural problem due to strategic errors that cost time, trust, and positioning. Because if something is expected of a world champion team, it is to play intelligence even when you do not have the best cards in your hand. However, in this case, Red Bull showed a worrying disconnection between its engineers, its tactical decisions, and the real demands of the circuit. The first and most obvious of these errors was the implementation of aerodynamic updates designed for a completely different circuit, Imola. Red Bull arrived in Monaco with an improvement package that included a new rear spoiler profile, changes in the shape of the side pontoons, and settings in the diffuser. These pieces, which had proven effective in a fluid route such as Imola, were transferred to Monaco with an optimistic but clearly misguided logic. The big difference between both circuits is not only at the average speed, but in the way the car interacts with the ground, the curbs, the distribution of the weight in short brakes, and the acceleration at low speed. In Monaco, the essential is not so much the pure aerodynamic load as the ability to respond to the chassis and the suspension, aspects that these updates not only did not solve but worse. Helmut Marko, main advisor to Red Bull, recognized him publicly after the classification. He said clearly that they did not know how to translate Imola's improvements into Monaco's unique demands. And that statement, coming from one of the most experienced figures of a team, reveals that they internally knew they had made an important calculation error. This failure is not less because it is not our fine adjustment that went wrong. We're talking about a planned technical strategy with weeks in advance, developed in simulators, tested in wind tunnels, and validated with data that, apparently, did not contemplate what was evident. Monaco needs a specific configuration, not a recycling of previous solutions. But the problems did not end there. To this mistake in the technical preparation, poor operational execution was added during the classification, particularly in the first session, Q1. Verstappen was blocked by Lewis Hamilton on the climb to Massenet, an incident that forced the Dutch pilot to abort one of his fast laps. The FIA, after reviewing the situation, sanctioned Hamilton with 3 positions on the grille. However, what cannot be overlooked is that Red Bull did not warn his pilot on time about the Mercedes position. In a circuit like Monaco, where traffic is one of the greatest enemies of performance, real-time information is absolutely critical. The lack of effective communication between the wall and Verstappen committed a valuable attempt, and what is worse, added pressure at a time when the car no longer gave margin for errors. What this demonstrates is that Red Bull not only failed in the previous technical analysis, but also in his ability to react within the weekend. And in Formula One, where the margins are so narrow, that lack of agility is paid expensive. When combined inadequately with coordination failures and questionable decisions, the result is a classification like the one we saw: a frustrated Verstappen, a baffled equipment, and a car outside its comfort zone. The most worrying thing about everything is that these types of errors, if they are not corrected at the root, can be repeated. And in a season as tight as the current one, losing ground for avoidable reasons can have direct consequences in the fight for the championship. At this point, there is no doubt that what happened in Monaco was the product of a cluster of bad decisions, both inside and outside the car. In the midst of the already complicated panorama facing Max Verstappen during the classification of the 2025 Monaco Grand Prix, there was a specific episode that, although it might seem a simple clue incident at first sight, ended up becoming a breakpoint within the weekend. I mean the moment that Lewis Hamilton blocked Verstappen in full climb to Massenet during Q1. This blockade not only forced the Red Bull pilot to abort a quick lap that could have been crucial, but also generated a wave of internal frustration that showed the growing tension within the team. Because when technical problems are combined with strategic errors and, as if that were not enough, external interference such as this is added, the result is a total loss of control over an environment that is already volatile. The first thing to understand is that Monaco does not forgive. There are no wide escapes, there are no correction areas. Any interference, any obstacle, even a tenth of a second loss by traffic can completely change the result of a session. And in this case, Hamilton, supposedly following his team's instructions, found himself right in Verstappen's trajectory in one of the key moments of the return attempt. Although later the FIA intervened and sanctioned the Mercedes pilot with a penalty of 3 positions on the grille, the damage was already done. That aborted return meant to a loss of rhythm, an alteration in the tire preparation cycle, and, above all, an emotional where that accumulated about the other problems already mentioned. But the most revealing was not the act itself, but the reaction of the Red Bull team. In high-pressure situations such as this, the wall is expected to act with speed and precision, alerting the pilot, adjusting the strategy on the march, and offering an immediate solution. None of that happened. Verstappen, when leaving the curve and finding traffic without prior notice, was exposed. What had to be an early maneuver by the team ended up being a coordination error that left his pilot without tools to avoid the situation. This failure in communication between the engineers in the pit wall and the pilot not only worsened things in practical terms, but also undermined Verstappen's confidence in the support he had to receive in real time. And in a circuit like Monaco, where every second counts, lose a clean turn in Q1 can leave consequences for the rest of the session. The situation also brought with it an immediate psychological effect. Verstappen, who was already fighting with an unpredictable car and poorly adapted to the layout, now had to face the pressure of finding a clean turn in the remaining short time, with the uncertainty of not knowing if he would find traffic again or not. That pressure led him to force in sectors where RB21 was already vulnerable, increasing the risk of making mistakes, and wearing even more the tires that, as we know, are critical in the narrow operational margin of the car. From that moment on, any attempt at recovery was uphill. And while the incident was caused by an opponent, the part of responsibility that corresponds to Red Bull cannot be ignored. Because Monaco traffic is not a surprise, it is a constant. The teams planned their entire session around how and when to avoid it. The fact that Hamilton was in that position is not only a problem of the Mercedes pilot, but also a reflection that the Red Bull strategic radar was not functioning as it should. It is in this type of detail that the classifications are defined, especially in a layout where the order of exit in the race is many times more important than the pure rhythm. This episode, added to the questionable decisions in the configuration of the car and the technical limitations of RB21, consolidated a panorama in which Verstappen felt isolated without real support to reverse the situation. And that, in a sport where the synergy between the pilot and the team is vital, represents a worrying symptom. Because it is not just about losing a return or not achieving a pole position. It is a clear sign that something in the operational structure of Red Bull is not functioning as before. After a weekend as complex as the one lived by Max Verstappen and the Red Bull team in Monaco, the big question that floats in the environment is what will happen from here. Because although the classification exposed a series of technical and strategic failures, the really decisive will be how the team reacts in the short and medium term. Formula One does not expect. And in a season where error margins have minimized, what is done, or what is stopped, in the coming weeks, can define the course of the entire championship. Monaco has been a severe warning. Red Bull can no longer rely on the talent of Verstappen or in the inertia of the previous seasons. Now, more than ever, you need to act with surgical precision to correct the course before it is too late. First, there is an immediate tactical decision that must be taken. How to raise the race after a classification in which Verstappen will leave the fourth position, benefited by the penalty to Hamilton, but still far from the ideal. The streets of Monaco do not allow simple advances, therefore, the team faces an important strategic dilemma. On the one hand, they can opt for an aggressive strategy that implies an early stop, trying to make an undercut to gain positions. But that decision entails a huge risk. To go out in the middle of traffic and look stuck behind slower cars, which would ruin any attempt to advance. On the other hand, they could go for a more conservative strategy, trying to extend the first stint and wait for the rest of the competitors to open the detention windows. This option minimizes the immediate risk, but also depends largely on the rhythm management and temperature of the tires, an aspect that has been problematic for RB21, especially on low-speed tracks. In the medium term, Red Bull has already recognized that a change of direction is necessary in its technical approach to urban circuits. And that turn cannot be improvised. The team has accelerated the development of a specific package that will be focused exclusively on improving performance in this type of path. There is a complete review of the rear suspension system, with the aim of increasing the car's ability to absorb curbs without losing stability. Reduced lateral diffusers are also working to better channel airflow in low-speed conditions, a recurrent weakness of RB21. In addition, modifications are projected in the geometry of the direction to reduce the rotation radius, something fundamental in circuits such as Singapore, Baku, or Monaco himself. These updates will not arrive immediately, but the date marked in red in the team calendar is the Singapore Grand Prix. It will be there where these new pieces probably debut, although Helmut Marko has already warned that it is not a magical solution, but a series of progressive adjustments. And it is precisely that nuance that should worry the most. Because while they are planning future improvements, their rivals, such as Ferrari and McLaren, are already executing. And they are doing it with tangible results. The domain that Red Bull knew how to impose for more than one season is being challenged in a real way and consistent by teams that have understood how to compete in technical scenarios, how to adapt to the change in aerodynamic regulations, and above all, how to take advantage of the weaknesses of which, until now, seemed invincible. In parallel to these technical issues, we will also have to pay close attention to the mood and psychological state of Verstappen. A pilot like him is not used to being a fourth, or publicly declare that his car feels ungovernable. And although it has the capacity and maturity to maintain the focus, each race in which it cannot fight for victory is a small crack that opens in the general confidence of the project. Not only yours, but also that of the environment. In Formula One, perception can change in a matter of weeks, and a team that until recently was considered untouchable can begin to be seen as vulnerable. This perception can influence negotiations, internal relationships, and even decisions that, in the face of the future, can make a huge difference. With all this on the table, the stage for Red Bull is clear. They must answer. It is not enough to recognize the mistakes, you have to solve them. It is not enough to identify weaknesses, we must transform them into strengths. And that requires not only engineering, but also leadership, tactical vision, and perfect synchronization among all parts of the team. The eyes of the world are put on them, and every movement they make, each update, each strategy, each message from the box, will be analyzed to the millimeter.